Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my ranking of my top 10 favorite fantasy book series. Today I will not be talking about standalone books, I will be talking about series as a whole. And so I went through and cataloged how many series I have read in their entirety, and then how many series I have read at least one or two books of. And so I wanted to see what that was like. I have read at least one or two books in about something like 35 series. It was 34 or 35 series. But I have completed 16 of those fantasy series, and I'm working on completing more as I go along. But today I'm talking about the top 10. I do have four honorable mentions because they were like just like a smidge off good enough to be on the top 10 list. And so I will talk about my four honorable mentions and then my actual top 10. And I of course know my list is going to look way different than most people's lists. But I'd love to hear what your list looks like in the comments down below. I've done this video. I did it like the week I started this channel about 3 years ago, and then I did it again about a year and a half ago, and I figured it was time for me to do another one because I am updating it. My tastes have changed a little bit. My thoughts on a series have changed. My opinions. One of my favorite book reviewers, Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, says legacy takes time, and that has happened because some of the book series have moved up because legacy took time, and some of them have moved down. So we'll see what happens as I go through the list. So let me talk about my first four honorable mentions. These are the books that they were amazing books and deserve to be discussed, but just couldn't make it into the top 10 because top 10 can only be 10. So one of them is going to be the Lord of the Rings / Middle Earth universe from Tolkien. I really enjoyed reading Lord of the Rings. I think it is one of the most creative and one of the most rich universes that has been created for fantasy, and it, of course, is one of the biggest and originals and inspired everything else. So it deserves to have a seat at the table for the discussion. The reason it's not necessarily on my top 10 list and is only an honorable mention is because the writing style at times is a little bit frustrating and can be a little bit ponderous at times. But I still love the characters, love the universe, love the series of The Lord of the Rings. I enjoyed The Hobbit. I love Beren and Luthien, and I enjoyed the Tales of the Perilous Realm, and so I intend to read more of Tolkien's writing eventually. But this is one I was like, you can't talk about fantasy without talking about this. And I know that some people will be horrified that's not in the top 10 or even in the top 5, but at least it's honorable mention. Next, I'm going to mention the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. This is a really long series of a bunch of kind of mystery / urban fantasy novels, almost like thrillers with how fast-paced and the nature of them. And I love them. I think they're really entertaining. I've read 6 of the books so far. I have more, and I intend to read more eventually. This is just such a fun and different concept than most fantasy. Most of the fantasy on here is epic fantasy with politics and armies and fighting and magic and dragons. This one has magic and it has politics, but it's on a much smaller level. This is more regular storytelling. This is more like believable, and it takes place in Chicago as opposed to in a fantasy land. So I think this series is really worth it. There's some lesser good parts of the series and some better parts of the series, but I think as a whole, I think so far for me this series has been really excellent, and that's why it's an honorable mention. My third honorable mention I'll mention is the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. I am not a grimdark person, and I think there's like one other grimdark series on this list. So I'm not a grimdark person, but I loved this trilogy. I think that this is a very different type of book that I normally read, but I was very impressed by the skill of creativity and writing style that R.F. Kuang has, despite being so grimdark. I think that she's also very readable. I think that she's very engaging in her storytelling, and you may not, quote, like the characters, but you are invested and interested in them. And I think that the way that she dealt with her world building was, to me, very fascinating. And so I really loved this trilogy, really enjoyed it. My final honorable mention is a book that some people would say, are you even supposed to count that as a favorite fantasy series? And that is the Circle series by Ted Dekker. This series is like a hybrid of, it's part kind of fantasy, but also part political thriller because part of it is set in modern day. And it also has some kind of sci-fi elements with some of the science behind it. And then, of course, it has the Christian elements to it as well. So it's a very weird hybrid to talk about. That being said, I love this series. Absolutely love it. I think that this is a series that stuck with me. I love reminiscing about it, the stories, the themes, the world building I really enjoy, and it's just very different from the others, and I really love it. And so that's my last honorable mention. So we've talked about the honorable mentions. We're getting into the actual top 10, and of my top 10, here's the breakdown. I have 6 books from Tor. Tor absolutely has been my favorite publisher for a while, and they turn in my favorite fantasy books. And some of my favorite sci-fi too. But for fantasy, for sure, Tor has been my favorite. So 6 of the 10 are Tor. I have 1 book from Orbit Books. I have 1 book from Baen Books, which I talk about a lot. And then I have 2 books from Del Rey. And the 2 book series from Del Rey are actually by the same author. There's only 1 author on here who has more than 1 series. So let's go ahead and get into the actual top 10 fantasy series ranked. With my number 10 is going to be The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. This is the 4-book series that has Malice, Valor, Ruin, and Wrath. This series, I think, got better with literally every installment. I enjoyed, even from the first book, I thought it was a really good book. I was even more impressed by the second and the third, and by the time I got to the fourth, I knew this was making it on the top 10 list. I think that John Gwynne, his world building is amazing. I think his action, the way he writes fight scenes and stuff, is amazing. His plotting is really good. And even his character work. His characters are engaging, and I like to think about them, and they go on very good journeys. If I had to say any problem with the book is it can be a little bloated at times, but even then, this series I think is totally worth it. And John Gwynne has definitely risen up the ranks to being one of my favorite authors now because this series was just so good. So that's my number 10 fantasy series. This one comes from Orbit Books. My number 9 is the most recent published series on the list, and it's actually an ongoing series. So only 2 of the books are out. I think it's going to be either 5 or 6 books in the series, and that is The Chronicles of Hanuvar by Howard Andrew Jones. The first book titled Lord of a Shattered Land. The second one's titled City of Marble and Blood. The third book is going to come out this year titled Shadows of the Something Mountain. Anyway, this is a sword and sorcery fantasy series, and this is very much a kind of a classic Robert E. Howard type story where you have this, it's almost told in like short story vignettes, but also they are all connected and it's continuing the journey for the character. This is about Hanuvar, who is he's kind of like Hannibal, and he is from Carthage, and his land has been attacked and has fought many wars with Rome, and his people have been basically captured and are either dead or are enslaved by their enemies. And so he is trying to save all of his people and rebuild a new country for his people without the enemies knowing about it. And he has to deal with weird creatures and magic and all that stuff as he goes along. And this is it's a superb fantasy series. And I just cannot wait to read more in this series. And I'm hoping that the next books continue to be amazing and that this will rise up my ranks of favorite book series of all time. So that's my number 9. Now getting into my number 8 is a very popular series. Won't surprise too many people that it's on here. I also love the TV show adaptation of this series, and that is The Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, also known as colloquially A Game of Thrones, because of the TV show. I think that this is an really good series. I actually was way too harsh on it when I first read the books a couple years ago. I wish I had been more complimentary of, especially the first 3. I think the first 3 books in the A Song of Ice and Fire series can go against any other books for fantasy. The way that you have the characters of the Stark family versus the Lannisters versus the Targaryens versus, all those different political families. The way that this book series deals with morality and deals with bad moral characters versus other bad moral characters. And I guess people say this book started the grimdark phase for fantasy, and I can totally get that. And so I think this is the only grimdark book series on the list. And it's very serious, but I think it's such a great series. I do not like all of the explicit sexual stuff in the book. I do not appreciate that. Yet, I still really think that this book series is very well done. Book 4 I didn't like. Book 5 was only okay, but I think books 1 through 3 are just amazing. Now, we probably won't ever get the finale for the series, but if Winds of Winter ever is released, I will read it by day 1, but it probably won't be released. So, anyway, that's my number 8. And it could have gone higher if he finished it, perhaps, but that's part of the thing that's keeping it from being so low down. Going into my number 7, this is, unfortunately, I don't have a single copy of the first book, so I'm doing a bind-up for this. My number 7 is the Magic Kingdom of Landover series by Terry Brooks. This was published by Del Rey. And I forgot to mention real quick, Game of Thrones, or the Song of Ice and Fire is done by Bantam. But this is, Magic Kingdom of Landover is done by Del Rey, written by Terry Brooks. The first book is a satire, basically. But the books 2 through 6 actually just read as straight up fantasy novels that kind of have a humorous element to them. But this series is about a lawyer from Chicago named Ben Holiday who is down on his luck. His wife is dead. His life is just boring. He hates everything. And all of a sudden, he sees an ad that he could buy this magical kingdom and go be the king of this kingdom for only $1 million. And being a lawyer in Chicago, he has that money. And so what he decides to do is he does that, and he goes and realizes why buying an entire magical kingdom only cost him $1 million, because the kingdom is in complete ruin. The people there are terrible. They're not listening to authority. The wizards there are totally inept. His counselor is a human turned into a dog. It is a messed up world. And there's also fairies, and there's these magical creatures like dragons, and there's this woman named Willow who is a fantastic love interest in this series. Willow is such a great character. And this series, it's 6 books, and each book is essentially it's like a standalone. It's not like some of these series where each book builds on the next and keeps it's not like you have to read the whole series to see the story. It's like book 1 tells a complete story. Book 2 tells its own complete story, continuing the character story type thing. So you could read one book and then be done, or you could keep going type thing. And I think this is just so underrated. People don't talk about it, but it's worth it. It is such a good series. So that's the Magic Kingdom of Landover is my number 7. Now it's time for my number 6, which is probably the least read series and the least talked about on BookTube. Because I literally have not seen anyone talk about this series before, and that is the Wake of the Dragon series by Kevin J. Anderson. The way that not only this series is pitched, but the way that Kevin has pitched it to people, I've heard him pitch this, is he says it is a faster paced, tighter, and completed version of Game of Thrones. I totally agree with that assessment. This is much tighter in story. It's only 3 books, and they're shorter. It is very fast-paced. It is very focused. It doesn't have too many... It has a big cast. It has a very large cast, but it's not unruly and completely incomprehensible like Feast for Crows and some of the other Game of Thrones books get. And so I totally understand that. And I would add in that this book has a little bit more magic. This is not, I would not describe this as a hard magic system. It's not. It is much like Game of Thrones. It's very much a soft magic system, but the magic is more prevalent here. It's more present here. And I like soft magic systems that are present. I do not like hard magic systems that are super present, or necessarily when it's like a soft magic system that's like barely there. Sometimes that's also a little bit weird, but this one I think is really good. And I think that Kevin just gets how to do political stories better than any other fantasy sci-fi writer. His science fiction political stories are also amazing too. So I really like this series, and I wish more people talked about it. The covers aren't good. I admit the covers aren't good. The Ukrainian cover is amazing, but I wish these covers were better. But still, it's a good series. Next, we have, so we're getting into my actual top five. And these books are books that I talk about a lot on the channel. We are getting into some of my favorite stories of all time. And one of them is completely new to the list because I hadn't read it the last time I made my fantasy series ranked list. But the other four I talk about so much you'll probably know, maybe not know the placement, but you'll know which books are present. So let's get into the top five. My number 5 favorite fantasy book series is The Symphony of Ages by Elizabeth Hayden, also known as the Rhapsody series. This is there's technically 9 books in the series. I think it's 3 trilogies is the way that people view it. And I've read the first 3 books, which form their own complete trilogy. And the first book is Rhapsody, the second book is Prophecy, and the third book is Destiny. Now, ironically, the second book is not that strong. I think the second book's just okay. Prophecy is just okay. But Rhapsody and Destiny, some of my favorite fantasy books ever. I could even potentially put them in my top 10 just individual fantasy novels of all time because I love them so much. And I think that Elizabeth Hayden has this writing style that just works so well for me and just hooked me. And the world building and the way she deals with history and depth of history in this book series really reminds me of Wheel of Time. And I loved reading this series, and it has gorgeous cover art by Royo. All 3 books have gorgeous cover art. And I think that just Elizabeth Hayden deals with dark themes and difficult themes that other authors sometimes try to tackle and don't do well. I think that Elizabeth Hayden deals with them amazingly and very nuanced too. And so I just love this series and the way it deals with music and the way it deals with action and romance. The romance in this series is fantastic. I love The Symphony of Ages. So that's my number 5 favorite fantasy series. That one's from Tor. And by the way, Wake of the Dragon was also Tor, so lots of Tor books. Next, I have a Del Rey book from the same author from the last Del Rey book, Terry Brooks, and that is his Shannara series. This is probably the book series that put Del Rey on the map back in the day, and it's one of their, I would describe it as their flagship series at the moment. Maybe Pierce Brown's science fiction books are their flagship series now, but for fantasy, this is their flagship series. The Shannara series is amazing. It's long. There's like 30 books, and this is the longest one. Most of the books are actually about 400 pages, so they're much more manageable. But this series this is the first fantasy novel I read, and I loved it, and I've been hooked on the series ever since. Yes, the first book is incredibly derivative of The Lord of the Rings. It's basically The Lord of the Rings redone as an easier story. Much like Wake of the Dragon is like a tighter and more focused version of Game of Thrones, Sword of Shannara is a tighter, more focused version of Lord of the Rings. And I love that. But past the first book, books 2 and on are all their original story, and they're really entertaining adventure fantasy stories. And they have a very soft magic system, but it's very present, as I said, and I think it's really excellently well done. And the great thing about it is it's done in like trilogies and duologies and tetralogies, so if you didn't like this duology, the next trilogy might be amazing. And if you didn't like this tetralogy, well, the next standalone might be amazing. So I think Terry Brooks is a really excellent author, and he totally deserves to be the number 4 slot on this list. Now we're getting into my number 3, and this was a difficult decision because people will be disappointed in, do I keep the Cosmere as one or split it up into the multi-series? I kept it as one. So I'm talking about the whole Cosmere here, although I'm going to hold up Way of Kings because it's probably the most famous, other than maybe Mistborn. I think that Brandon Sanderson is my current favorite fantasy author Full stop. He's my favorite author. The way he writes fantasy, the way he writes sci-fi, the way he writes kids books, the way he writes young adult. I mean, he's an amazing writer. And also what he's doing for the business of publishing is just superb. And I really appreciate him and value him. And his whole Cosmere, it's much more hard magic system than I appreciate, and I don't like the detailed nature of magic systems when they get into the hard stuff. But the way that he deals with characters and story and themes are so amazing. I just look past the world building and the magic because his characters, his story and his themes are just the top in the fantasy game. They're practically unmatched, and so that's why the Cosmere has to be very high on my list at number 3. Again, more Tor books. And next, we're going to my number 2 favorite fantasy series on my list, and my number 2 favorite fantasy series is The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This is a tremendous fantasy series. This was the first fantasy series that I completed. Shannara, The Sword of Shannara was the first fantasy novel that I started, but the first full fantasy universe series that I completed was The Wheel of Time. And the reason I completed it first was because it was so engrossing. And even the weakest elements of The Wheel of Time, to me, are better than some other series' best moments. I love this series from beginning to end. Yes, even the slog. I would say that the slog, I would still say that books 7 through 10, which are traditionally discussed as the slog, are the weakest of the series, and I'll agree with that. But I think that that those are still really entertaining books, and books 1 through 6, amazing, and books 11 through 14 are some of my favorite fantasy books of all time, and the payoff in those books is unmatched. It's unmatched. Not even Game of Thrones, not even other fantasy series that are completed, not even the Cosmere yet, although the Cosmere could take this, depending on how Brandon Sanderson does it. But the ending of The Wheel of Time, I think the last 4 books are just unmatched in payoff. And so, also, of course, the world building, and I love the characters, and I love the story. Again, the magic system stuff, I don't care about hard magic system stuff, but it's still really entertaining. And of course, this is another example of Tor books with their entry on the list. And finally, we get to my favorite fantasy series. And some people will be like, it used to be that Wheel of Time was my favorite fantasy series. And I still think it's in contention for it. But the more I think about it, and I discussed earlier about the idea that legacy takes time, this next series, my number 1 series, is the series that I think about the most. The series I reminisce about the most. When I think I want to go back and reread books, I think about this series. When I first read this series, I loved it, but I didn't have the huge respect for it. And then over time, I think about it so much, and I think, yes, I should have loved it more. I should have appreciated it more. And I'm so sad that the author couldn't finish it, and that is David Farland's The Rune Lords. I am probably the biggest advocate of the Rune Lords series on YouTube, on BookTube, and I will continue to be that advocate because I love this series. I think it is so good. The magic system is my favorite magic system in a fantasy series. The world building, superb. The characters, superb. The writing style, the way he describes nature, the way he describes action, the way that he describes things, I love. The themes of the books are fantastic, and the nuance and the kind of, I want to say, the atmosphere that the books produce, I think is so good. And the first 4 books form a complete arc. Like, it's a full story, first 4 books. And then he had 4 books with an intention to do a 5th final book that formed a second arc. And unfortunately, he died before he could do the final book. And there's been talk over the years of them perhaps having someone else finish it up. But regardless, the first 4 are a complete story. And I absolutely think, when I just think about those first 4 books, this becomes my favorite fantasy series of all time. And it's so amazing. I have to do a reread eventually because it's just such a good series. And so that is my number 1 favorite fantasy series of all time. And so if you've read any of these books, let me know. Do you agree with my placement? Have you read them? Do you think that these are good series as well? Or do you think these are bad series and I shouldn't be including them? Let me know those thoughts. Also, if you have your own fantasy series ranking list, let me know that as well. And let me know other types of videos you'd like to see on the channel. Let me know all your thoughts and comments in the comments down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.